In a time when Britain has a female Prime Minister, it is hard to imagine a time when women were discouraged from taking a role in court, which was seen as a male-dominated sphere. However, after the restoration of 1660, this changed, as Charles II's royal mistresses forced their way into this sphere, and they made their presence known. Myself and several other students from the University of Southampton will be investigating who were the notorious and nefarious women of Restoration London, and how did they gain their reputation.
We'll be looking at the mistresses of Charles II and how they gained notoriety through their controversial actions and morals, which were perceived by some as wicked and shameful. The stories of the lives of Nell, Louise and Barbara are enticing, full of drama and scandal. These women thrived in Charles II's Restoration Court, taking advantage of the political landscape and the increasing freedoms.
After Charles II spent part of his exile in France, the king took his cue from the French court in promoting lavish parties and having 13 mistresses. The atmosphere of Charles's court after his restoration was in complete contrast to that of the interregnum.
His father Charles I was executed in 1649 by his parliament, and in his place Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector. In the court of Oliver Cromwell, purity and morals were a recurring theme, resulting in the most extreme of circumstances. For example, even entertainment was discouraged as it was seen as a promiscuous industry. Attitudes towards women were even exemplified by their choice of dress. For example, women would be expected to wear something similar to this, a long black dress to maintain modesty, and even a white cloth to cover their head. In a stark contrast to the years of the interregnum, the women in the court of Charles II were bold and even brazen in their chosen portraits. For example, Nell Gwynn, one of Charles II's most notorious mistresses, was even painted naked. This was something that would have been unheard of during the time of the interregnum, and it's interesting to see just how different times changed in the space of a few years.
Born into the Portuguese House of Braganza, Catherine became Queen Consort to King Charles II, securing an alliance between England and Portugal. Her Roman Catholic religion, as well as her being a foreign woman, made her unpopular at court. She became known for her formal behaviour, one that no longer belonged in Restoration London. This portrait of Catherine of Braganza was painted by Derek Stoop circa 1660 to 61. A year before her marriage to Charles II. Derek Stoop was to become Catherine's chief painter, a comparison to the mistress's preferred Sir Peter Lale. Here, the Queen is shown to be hostile, shown by the tones of her clothing and of the background, which is a comparison to later portraits that we will see of the mistresses, such as Palmer and Nell Gwynn, who are shown in a flamboyant manner. Her position in court was already established, thus, unlike the mistresses, she didn't need to use her sexual allure or charm. Therefore, despite not being notorious nor nefarious, the Queen became a chief rival of the mistresses in terms of influence and attraction of the King.
I'm going to pass over to Danielle, who's going to be discussing one of Charles II's most notorious mistresses, Barbara Palmer.
Barbara Palmer was the first prominent royal mistress of Charles II. She was the daughter of William Villiers, the second Viscount Grandy's son, whose father was a half-brother to George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham under Charles I. Her first meeting with Charles has been disputed, as he acknowledged her first daughter Anne, born in February 1661, after his return to England in May 1660. He first acknowledged that Barbara was a mistress of Charles II by insisting on giving a grant to her husband Roger Palmer, titling him Baron Limerick and the Earl of Castlemaine, making Barbara the Countess of Castlemaine. His first documentation describes the finest smocks and her linen petticoat of My Lady Castlemaine. His objectification demonstrates his physical interest in her, highlighting the ownership he had over Barbara in his journal. In addition, he comments that her outfit was laced with rich lace at the bottom that I ever saw, emphasising the detail at which he noticed Barbara. It also emphasises the sensual and lustful impression he had of Barbara.
So how did Palmer's presence affect Charles II's new very religious wife, Catherine of Braganza?
Catherine Braganza, Charles II's wife, first came to England in May 1662, causing a jealousy between Barbara and the king's new bride. She wanted to dominate the court through her position as mistress. Barbara was appointed as Lady of the Bedchamber to Catherine, which undoubtedly made Catherine feel uncomfortable, but Barbara's plan was working. With Charles' assertion, Catherine's resistance was overpowered, allowing Barbara to take such an influential place. Barbara was now able to attend court events and balls. In December 1662, she appeared in the first dance for the Duke of Monmouth, James Scott. Due to her consolidation of power, Barbara was introduced to Sir Peter Lely, who would go on to paint portraits of her as the figure of Madonna and St. Catherine, demonstrating her provocation of the Queen. Barbara converted to Catholicism, and this became public in December 1662. However, arguably her intentions were not genuine. It has been speculated that she was scared of death due to a dangerous illness.
So as well as being a general hindrance to Catherine and Charles's marriage, how much did she interfere with politics?
Barbara hosted many dinners for Charles, for example for the French ambassador and his wife, making her presence known internationally. She also continued to have children under Charles, causing further conflict with the Queen.
Okay, so here is a portrait of Barbara Palmer. As you can see, she is with her child, Charles Fitzroy, who was also son of Charles II.
You can see in the painting that she's loosely clothed and painted as the Madonna figure, emphasising her fertility and her childbearing abilities.
It also shows her as the Virgin Mary, showing her high status and potential challenge to the Queen.
Also, by Barbara being painted in this way with her child, she's bragging her fertility against the Queen, showing that she was able to raise the King's children, something which his wife was unable to do.
In contrast to paintings of Nell Gwynn, who is presented in nude, Barbara always maintains a sense of status and respectability. She was the original mistress after all, giving her pride and the benchmark for the other women. Barbara moved here to Berkshire House near St James's Park. Charles paid £4,000 for her to live here. Historian Sonia Wine suggested that she made the transition from royal mistress to close friend. However, because of this, she was still involved within court factions which formed between the King's ministers. She sidelined with Charles Berkeley, Earl of Falmouth. However, the Earl of Southampton was not so lucky. He suffered at the expense of Barbara, for she disapproved of her grants towards her. This led to his downfall. In addition, she fell to the side of Louise, who we will later speak about.
Now I'm joined by Lucy, our expert on Louise. So, can you give us a bit of background about her?
I'm standing on a bridge in St James's Park in front of Buckingham Palace. Louise, Duchess of Portsmouth, was born in September 1649 into an ancient but impoverished family from Brittany. From 1668, whilst in France, she served under the household of Henrietta Anne Stuart, sister of Charles II. In June 1670, she accompanied Henrietta to England for the signing of the Treaty of Dover. This occasion marked her first meeting with Charles II. With the sudden death of Henrietta, Louise was left unprovided for. This was a definite turning point for the Duchess, as Charles II stepped in and appointed her lady-in-waiting to his own queen, Catherine of Braganza, who was quickly noticed at court, with the diarist John Evelyn describing her as a famed beauty. Louise soon replaced Barbara Villiers as the king's principal mistress, and remained in his affections until his death in 1685. According to many contemporary accounts, Louise proved to be ambitious and self-seeking, and within only a year of being at the English court, she bore the king a son, Charles Lennox, the first Duke of Richmond. The following year, she was created Duchess of Portsmouth. This shows us the importance surrounding a woman's fertility and the pressure placed on them to produce healthy male offspring, and how they would be rewarded for doing so.
So she clearly had significant influence over Charles II's affection, but like Palmer, did she have a considerable say in affairs of state?
There is great debate over how much influence the mistresses had over the king. The Marquise de St Maurice, Savoy's ambassador, claimed, "It is said the ladies have great influence over the mind of the King of England," and the Duchess of Portsmouth was no exception. Louise was an influential figure at court and was even allowed to be present during political talks. Portsmouth's progress to the centre of court politics was closely watched and encouraged by Louis XIV, who attempted to use her to promote French interests. In 1675, an expensive pair of earrings was presented to her by the French. After this, Portsmouth frequently began to facilitate access to Charles II for the French ambassador in her own apartments. According to Henry Sidney, Earl of Romney, she had more power over the king than can be imagined. The instalment of Portsmouth's son as Knight of the Garter and then as Master of the Horse confirmed her favour with Charles. Even persistent rumours of an affair between Portsmouth and a French nobleman in 1683 had no impact on Charles's affections towards Louise. In a letter of 1684, the king wrote, "'Tis impossible to express the true passion and kindness I have for my dearest Fubs." The immense wealth gained by the mistresses from the king was often seen as mirroring their influence. In 1673, Louise was granted the titles of Baroness Petersfield, Countess of Ferrum, and Duchess of Portsmouth, while her pensions and money allowances were enormous. In 1681 alone, she received £136,000. Louise's magnificent apartments at Whitehall, with their lavish decorations, signified her political and social influence at court. Evelyn described them in 1675 as luxuriously furnished and with 10 times the richness and glory beyond the Queen's. Unlike her predecessor, Barbara Palmer, who had openly insulted the Queen, Louise was careful to show her every respect, and relations between the two women were never less than amicable. However, the same cannot be said for the relationship between Louise and Nell Gwynn. They openly competed for the King's affections and influence over him. Louise was deeply disliked by the English people, but not because of her notorious promiscuity, but rather due to her activities in the interest of France. The transformation of how Louise was presented in portraits shows an interesting alteration in both how she viewed herself and how she wished the court and public to view her. This portrait, painted in 1673, is one of Lely's most sensual compositions. Portsmouth is presented as confident and alluring, holding her long black curls in her fingertips. This gesture is derived directly from the Renaissance depiction of a goddess. Her loosely draped blue silk dress reveals her creamy white skin. Her features, almond-shaped eyes, gently arched eyebrows, a straight nose, and full red lips all epitomise ideal beauty of the late 1600s. This portrait is purposefully French in its manner. Rather than turning her into an English beauty, Portsmouth is deliberately captured as a beautiful French Renaissance woman. This portrait is in stark contrast to one of 1675, in which Louise is painted alongside her son, Charles. It shows the expectations of women and of ideal motherhood of the period. Louise is flaunting her fertility and is shown to be far more of a respectable woman now that she has had a son. She is dressed in incredibly expensive clothing. This is in contrast to her previous portraits where she is shown to be almost fully undressed.
Now I'm going to pass over to Melissa to discuss Nell Gwynn.
Nell Gwynn is one of the most memorable and notorious of the King's mistresses, and has also been credited as the first actress of England. Taking advantage of the breakdown of gender barriers in the theatre, Nell was able to rise to a position of power, both socially and politically. She was born into a poor family, but soon rose to economic and social status. Nell's relationship with the theatre began in her early teens, selling oranges in the King's Theatre. However, she soon rose to a position where she dominated the stage, bringing a voice to female parts that had not been seen before in theatre. It was on the stage that Nell first caught the eye of the King. Like many of the mistresses, Nell Gwynn exerted a form of influence over the King. Most notably, she was able to persuade the King to free the Duke of Buckingham. The diarist Samuel Pepys often noted of his interactions with her and called her Pretty Witty Nell.
So Nell's more humble beginnings meant that her portraiture, in some cases, were incredibly different to those of Charles II's more reputable mistresses. In what cases did they differ?
This portrait of Nell Gwynn was produced by Thomas van der Wilt. This portrait was made and reproduced in the year 1687, the year that Nell Gwynn died. From this, one can assume that this reproduction is in response to her death. Here we see the influence that the mistresses garner. Even after death, there are people who want to know about them. Thus, the fact that this piece was reproduced hints towards a demand and the consumer market that surrounded the mistresses of this time. Thus, their notoriety and nefarious behaviour was demanded by the consumer market. Nell Gwynn is illustrated surrounded by drapings and fabrics. This luxurious atmosphere is a reflection of what the royal mistresses would have experienced. Her hair is shown in the fashion of the court, highlighting how she had access to the fashion of the elites of Restoration London. In this portrait, Nell Gwynn's sexualisation is clear, through her bare chest and her almost seductive look towards the onlooker. Often painted bare-chested, her portraits are a reminder of her status as royal mistress, portraying her power to be both sexualised but also retaining influence. Biographers such as Charles Beauclerk have also presented her as the people's princess, displaying her as the connection between the monarch and the people. Therefore, her popularity amongst the male members of court. However, she also had an image in the public eye. Her humble origins were both an attraction and garnered scorn from contemporaries. This portrait of Nell was originally painted by Sir Peter Lale and later reproduced circa 1679. by Richard Thompson and highlights Nell and her two sons which she had with Charles II. In stark contrast to the previous portrait, we see a more modest form of representation of Nell, however not to the standards of the Catholic Queen Catherine. A common theme among the mistresses, where after having children, they were shown in a more respectable manner. This shows Nell has fulfilled her duty of motherhood, and therefore conforming to the traditional place of women in society. However, it is well known of the rivalry to produce sons between the mistresses and the Queen. When we also re-emphasise the ability to reproduce this image, a clear message is being made to justify Nell's position as mistress. This portrait represents the dual image of Nell Gwynn as both a courtesan and a maternal figure. The fact that both images garnered consumeristic reproductions represents Nell Gwynn's notoriety and celebrity status. This portrait is an example of the rivalry amongst court to gain favour of the king, as well as to justify their position and power at court. Her development from rags to riches is comparable to a modern Cinderella story. Her legacy is not simply as a mistress within the paintings of history, but rather she paved the way for female domination on all aspects of society. Without her and her contemporary women, empowerment may have been pushed back several years. Nell has become a symbol of the liberation seen in Restoration London, from female participation in the theatre to the increase in the sexual nature of society.
As we have seen, these three women were able to rise considerably as a direct result from their relationship with Charles II. Now I'm going to pass over to Georgia and Yasmin, who are going to discuss what happened to these women after Charles II died.
In regards of Nell Gwynn, when the king died in February 1685, James II obeyed his brother's deathbed wish to let not poor Nellie starve. This led him paying off most of her debts and provided her an annual pension of £1,500. He also paid off the mortgage on Nell's Nottinghamshire lodge in Bestwood. James also put pressure on Nell and her son Charles to convert to Catholicism, but she refused. This is an indication of just how headstrong she was as an individual. Nell only survived Charles by 2 years and died in November 1687. Clifford Bax argues that almost certainly she died due to her acquired variety of syphilis. Nell was a very influential figure, as she became a legend, and she was the only royal mistress in English history to provoke popular affection. In regards of Barbara Palmer, after the king's death at the age of 45, she began an affair with Cardinal Goodman, and in March 1686 she gave birth to his child, a son. In 1700, Barbara moved into a house on Chiswick Moor, which is now known as Walpole House. In 1705, her estranged husband Roger Palmer died, and she married Major General Robert Bow Fielding, an unscrupulous fortune hunter. She died at the age of 68 on the 9th of October 1709. Barbara was buried in the churchyard at St Nicholas, Chiswick.
Following the death of Charles, the Duchess of Portsmouth found herself completely isolated. With her only form of royal protection gone, she was left to face the consequences of her active role in politics completely by herself. This cued her prompt return to France, taking Charles II's son, the Duke of Richmond, with her. Her unpopularity resulted in her losing the pensions that were granted to her by Charles II, that were lost either during the rule of James II or in the later rebellion. She returned to England twice in the rest of her life, the first time during the reign of Charles II and the last time for the coronation of George I. The Duchess of Portsmouth spent the rest of her life faced with increasing mounting debts, as well as finding solace in religion. Her debts were later cleared by Louis XVI, who decided to take her under his care. She died on the 14th of November in the year 1734.
There is no denying the empowerment of the mistresses during the reign of Charles II. In a striking contrast to the legacy of the interregnum, women of high prominence at the court of Charles II were able to take influence, amass wealth, and even cultivate celebrity following in a style similar to what one would see in the 21st century. The rise of the career of mistresses was one that brought mystery, involving risk, ambition, and even at times political intrigue, making the mistresses of Charles II as entrenched in court life as the Queen herself.
Women such as Barbara Palmer were able to actively fight against the establishment, whilst Louise, the Duchess of Portsmouth, was even well versed in the practice of foreign policy. Although these women's power were intrinsically linked to the king, there was no doubt they were able to use their allure and their wit to gain as much social and sometimes even political influence as any man. Therefore, we've come to the conclusion that whilst this can be deemed as a form of male exploitation in the 21st century, during the time of these women, they used female empowerment in order to make political, social, and even economic choices in their own life.
As young women ourselves celebrating 100 years of the vote, in hindsight, we view some of these women as the first political agents of their time. Their portraits are filled with messages about the empowerment they felt over their own bodies, which resonates when today's society's calls for females to be empowered by their own bodies and sexuality. They strove for political power, defied stereotypical expectations, and paved the way for future feminist campaigns to come. These women truly were ahead of their time.